Well, we appreciate you as ever as joining us on a Thursday, third Thursday. Comes around pretty darn quick. Well, we'll go ahead and get started, and you think people will join us, no doubt, in just a few minutes. Just a brief little introduction. Um, you all know, or if you're joining us for this first time, welcome. If you're repeating attendees, and I know many of you are, the Knoxville History Project, our mission is to research, preserve, and promote the history and culture of Knoxville, Tennessee. We do that every day. Just want to shout out on our website. We changed the icon for the recorded talks, recorded the Zooms. So again, if you go to our engage page, it's basically where it was before, but we've just retitled it, and you can see it there on the second row. So it's no longer called History Happy Hours. It's recorded programs, and hopefully that's a little bit more clearer if you're looking for a recorded program. And as always, I encourage you to support this ongoing nonprofit. We rely on your support, and whether you make a donation or buy a book or a piece of merchandise on our online shop, or at an event, we sincerely appreciate you. So I'm quickly going to hand it over to Jack and talk about Divas, significant women performers in Knoxville. Over to you, Jack.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Paul, and thanks very much for your help, Paul, in putting this show together, which is one of the more fun projects I've worked on this year, I think. And thanks also to Nicole for all the technical support and keeping this going every month. But couldn't do this without either one of you all. Anyway, I wanted to talk about these performers and performances in Knoxville history because I've often seen them referred to, and when we're talking about the history of the Bijou Theater or Staub's Opera House or the Gem Theater, but there's almost never any context of where they were in their careers, what kind of impact they had on Knoxville, how they were received here. And I think it's kind of just an interesting irony that women who, 40 years before women were allowed to vote, they sometimes caused a great big stir in Knoxville. This it happened over and over. Women who were just adored who came here and performed either in singing or acting roles. But we're just skimming kind of some of the most famous ones here, and some of them are just kind of jaw-droppingly famous, and you would not imagine that they would come to a town the size of Knoxville because they were famous across Europe, but they're here. But we, of course, during the Victorian era, women didn't vote, but they were kind of put on pedestals, and sometimes that pedestal was a stage. Even when they didn't live here, and we're going to be talking about a couple of Knoxville women just to acknowledge them, who came from Knoxville and became famous. These are mostly people who didn't live here, but came here long enough to become part of Knoxville's culture, if only for a few hours. And they influenced those who saw them, sometimes in direct ways that were acknowledged. The first one, Paul, is a local person, right? Yeah, this is a woman named Sue Boyd Barton, kind of a rare picture of her. And she was our first, I think, our first local diva. They called her Knoxville's Jenny Lind, after the famous European vocalist. She co-founded the Knoxville Philharmonic Society in 1867, 1868. But was a singer herself and was one of the first stars of that organization. She was the ne plus ultra, as they called her, the greatest possible singer and here in Knoxville. And she was married another singer, a guy from Massachusetts. She was from an old Knoxville family, the Boyds. I think her father had been mayor, but she married a guy named Alvin Barton, who was from Massachusetts. And he was a singer and opera supporter. This was a big thing, and it's interesting to think that when people think that Knoxville was putting on airs, it was this town not too far removed from its pioneer past that had opera in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, and as if we were putting on airs. And I don't doubt there was some of that, but the fact is, a lot of the people who lived here who were leading this movement to bring opera to Knoxville were people from German-speaking nations from Germany and Austria and Hungary who had had opera in their homes and wanted to bring it to their new home in Knoxville. So a lot of this operatic movement was led by Germans, people who had grown up with it. So they naturally they brought opera with them. But Paul just showed the picture of Staub's Opera House. This was built to in response to the demand for opera. Before that, we'd had opera before this, about 5 years before this, and it was in the Masonic Hall or and Union Halls and things like that around downtown Knoxville. And but they in 1872, Peter Staub, who was one of these European immigrants, he was a German-speaking immigrant from Switzerland, built this opera house, the first big opera house in this region, and it was very popular. It didn't just have opera; it had a lot of vaudeville and Broadway shows and other things too. But they had and also lectures. You know, Frederick Douglass spoke in this building. But they had a lot of opera and especially operatic arias, like shows of arias, and but this was kind of the center of a lot of Knoxville's opera activity for 60 years or so. Later known as the Lyric Theater. And this was the first really big star who ever came to Knoxville. Lillie Langtry was from England. She was from the island of Jersey. She was known as the Jersey Lily, and she was really kind of one of the first international celebrities. You might say, she was famous for being famous. She was famous for being beautiful and for having lots of prominent boyfriends. The most famous of whom was Prince Edward, the future King Edward. But she was famous before she began just for her beauty, and her personal life, before she began her acting career in the early 1880s. When the Daily Tribune heard that she might be touring in America in 1881, people were giving her a hard time about her personal life. And the Daily Tribune in Knoxville said perhaps there is no legitimate way to prevent her visit. But by 1882, there were headlines saying, "Will Lillie Langtry come to Knoxville?" In spite of all these severe criticisms, especially concerning her love life, and she, like I say, had a lot of boyfriends, some prominent ones. At the same time, she was idolized and popular, I think, in a way that we might only compare to Taylor Swift or someone today. There were Langtry hats that were sold in Knoxville, Langtry hairpins, Langtry garters, Langtry shoes, Langtry haircuts. Everybody wanted to look like Lillie Langtry, women anyway, and I expect some men. But finally, at Staub's Opera House, the building we just saw, she came here in early 1888, portraying Lena Despard, a woman of the world, in a fairly new play called As in a Looking Glass. I've tried to find out something more about this play. It was later a silent film, which has subsequently been lost. But she was 34 years old when she came here, and this was the first really major showbiz sensation in Knoxville that I know of, except for Tom Thumb, perhaps, who'd been here several years earlier. And speculators bought large blocks of tickets, and I suspect this is the first local episode phenomenon of ticket scalping in Knoxville history, long before football was even a thing here. But the Daily Tribune gave kind of a wise guy response to the show. The people who went to Staub's Opera Theater last night went with the expectation of seeing a beautiful woman do some clever acting. They saw a beautiful woman. So it was kind of a not so polite put down, but she admitted that she was not formally trained as an actress, and a lot of people noticed that. But Knoxvillians seemed to want to like her anyway, and she remained popular through a lot of her life. She was famously idolized by a Wild West figure, Judge Roy Bean, and who just really lived for her, even though they apparently never met. But she's played by Ava Gardner in The Life and Times of Judge Roy Bean with Paul Newman. But then we started having some people who were genuinely talented coming to town. One was a star named Emma Uke, who was an Austrian lyric soprano. She came here for the June Festival, which I have maybe not trying to stretch a point too much, saying was kind of like our big years of the 1880s and 90s. This was a big international festival that was held here in Knoxville, a music festival, 4-day festival, just like big years, that had lots and lots of performers and performances, and some of them pretty surprising ones. I once mentioned in an article in Metropulse that Emma Uke played in Knoxville in 1883, and this was dumbfounding to a friend of mine who's an opera scholar, who was just amazed to hear that this very famous singer had performed on Gay Street, where the Rossini Festival is going to be on Saturday, by the way. But along with her in that same time, and look at all these names, you may recognize another one, that of Victor Herbert, who is this is the composer of operetta, operettas, musicals, including what like the one that spawned Babes in Toyland and the Merry Widow, and some of those things are Victor Herbert, very, very popular operetta composer. But he was in his late 20s, I think, when he was here in Knoxville. But speaking of divas, another woman, Adele Aus der Oy, who was a German pianist and composer, then 27 and a student of Franz Liszt, who had recently died. So this was a chance to see famous people and hear famous people who people had only heard of, and of course this was before good records, so people had not heard these people's voice and got excited about getting a chance to hear these people sing for the first time. But that was a musical thing, and of course we had acting also at Staub's Opera House, and I think the most famous actress of her era was Sarah Bernhardt. She was a French actress, best known in Europe. She was well known and respected as an actress. By the time she got to Knoxville, she was 47 years old. And at Staub, she was in a play called La Tosca. And this is kind of surprising to see because this is before Puccini wrote the opera Tosca. So this, which was in fact inspired by this play, which was, became popular in Europe. This was 1892, I guess, that early 1892 that she came here. About 10 years after her U.S. debut, she was here. Played Sardou wrote this play, and she played the title role, La Tosca, and had created the role in Paris just 4 years earlier. So this is a fairly new play that she performed in. By the way, there's the play had a villain called Scarpia, and it's notable that Sarah Bernhardt somehow obtained a pet lion and named the lion Scarpia. I would love to hear more about that. But anyway, she had an interesting it was an interesting moment when the most famous performer in the world, arguably in 1891, came to Knoxville and performed in this La Tosca play in 1891. All right, this is something a woman that I was not very familiar with until I saw a documentary a year or two ago, Sissy Rosetta Jones. But I've learned that she was a major figure, and not just in Black music in America, but in music in general of her era. She was from Rhode Island. She was the first Black performer at Carnegie Hall. She had performed works of Verdi and Gounod, operatic works, had worked directly with Antoni Dvorak, but she sang at the White House several times. But she came to Staub's several times in the early 1900s when she was in her 30s. With something called the Black Patty Troubadours. Black Patty was her nickname. Patty was an Italian singer, and they called her the Black Patty. But she was Adelina Patti was a very famous Italian opera singer. But she came here with a troupe of 80 performers, including jugglers, dancers, singers, acrobats. This was a big deal. And in Staub's, like a lot of most plays, Staub's would reserve the upper balcony. It had two balconies. The upper balcony was reserved for black customers, audience members. But this time they opened both balconies to a black audience because they knew there would be a lot of interest from the black community in Knoxville to see Sissy Retta Jones. They described this as she was here actually several times, and they called it a ragtime frolic, which suggests to me it probably was not. She was not doing a lot of operatic work there. But she returned a couple of times in November of the same year, 1900, and September of 1903. It was described as 3 hours of mirth and melody, and her voice was described as bird-like. It's unknown again whether she performed any of these famous operatic pieces that she had, by Verdi and others that she had worked on over the years. She died this was the height of her career, though, and in the early 1900s. She died in 1933, almost utterly forgotten. And I have not found a mention of her in local papers for about 80 years after her performances performances at Staub's Opera House. But that's a rare. We did some searching to find this rare ad for one of those performances. All right, and Ethel Barrymore. That's a name that even young people who only go to movies know, because of course Drew Barrymore, I think it was her great niece, is famous today. But a lot of people remember John and Lionel Barrymore, who were very famous Hollywood actors in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. But Ethel was famous before the rest of them were. Ethel, the sister, I think the middle sister, became just leapt onto the Broadway scene in 1901 with a play called Captain Jinks of the Horse Marines, is the full name of it. It was her first Broadway role as Madame Trentoni, which had opened just a few months before. I mean, this was not like Hamilton coming to the Tennessee after 8 years after it was at Broadway. This is a few months after this play opened in New York that she brought it on a limited tour. And why she picked Knoxville, she toured to New Orleans, Mobile, Atlanta, and Knoxville. It may have been the train routes, but those were the basic cities she performed in during these tours. But it was January 1902. She was only 22 years old, and this is probably about what she looked like at the time. She, of course, lived into the movie era, and you might see her as an older woman in Hollywood movies of the 30s and 40s. But this was an interesting moment. A sidelight is that the train engine was traveling toward Knoxville in North Georgia when the engine exploded, and the troop was stranded for a few hours. And it kind of is a representation of the meaning of the word trooper, is that this troop got together and were able to make it to Knoxville and not miss the curtain before the performance later the same day. This train explosion was early on the day that they were due to open at Staub's Opera House. It was described as one of the Journal and Tribune described it as one of the largest and most fashionable audiences that ever filled Staub's Theater. Saw Miss Ethel Barrymore score a marked triumph last evening. Trentoni, cleverly interpreted by Barrymore, who is pretty, composed, and decidedly interesting at all times. That's probably the best thing an actor can be called, is interesting. But one interesting thing about the play is that part of it was making fun of the funny costumes that had been in vogue in the 1880s, which was just like 25 or 30 years ago. And can you imagine making fun of the clothes we were wearing 25? I think I mean, this shirt. I was probably wearing this shirt 25 years ago, but I may not notice fashions changes as much as some other people do. But the fact that this was kind of part of the fun was making fun of the people, the way Americans dressed just not so long ago. The Knoxville Sentinel said Ethel Barrymore should feel flattered with her success and moving the hearts of Knoxville audiences, which are usually cold and slow to show appreciation. She received 7 curtain calls. That was interesting, and it's interesting that even today I know performers who say the same thing about Knoxville audiences, but she must have been an impressive performer who kind of broke that pattern. They went on to say, Miss Barrymore is one of the most beautiful women ever seen on the stage. Her voice is a deep alto and in pathos is impressive, while in humor it is most catchy. Her smile is one to make men rave over her. In fact, she had her whole audience, masculine and feminine, so en rapport that she was greeted with applause whenever she appeared, while a deep hush hung over the theater while she was speaking her lines. Um, but this was uh, this was a moment for Knoxville. Her brothers, John and Lionel, would later perform in the same theater, but I don't. They didn't get that notice quite like Ethel did. Um, but there's something I want to bring up that partly just because it has to do with I might not have mentioned the next one because she's not as famous today as Ethel Barrymore is, if not for a coincidence about the night that she played here. But next, Paul, the next one is about, if I'm not mistaken, Allah Nazimo. No, yeah, here's the Bijou Theater. And this is just to give you some context. This is directly across the street, built in 1909, directly across the street from Staub's Opera House. So these two theaters, they were often owned by the same organization, uh, competed for audiences. And the Bijou was smaller than Staub's, but had great acoustics and is still a great theater. Um, but there was a one night that interesting people were at both Staub's and the Bijou, and Alla Nazimova was at Staub's one night in 1914. She actually she had been here at Staub's in 1909 in A Doll's House, a famous play by Henrik Ibsen. But she was back at Staub's in January of 1914 at age 34. She was a remarkable woman. She was married but openly bisexual, and it's almost as if actresses and actors lived in a different world with different rules than the rest of people in Victorian and Edwardian America. But later opened something called the Garden of Allah Hotel in Hollywood. It was after most of her performing career was over. But the the Knoxville newspaper said Madame Nazimova made a most favorable impression on her first visit to the city a few years ago. They're talking about 5 years ago for the Ibsen play. She was applauded Thursday night, but not with notable heartiness. Many who remembered the performance and the promise of her earlier years could not but regret that she had chosen a role that gave little play to her histrionic powers. Madame Nazimova seemed to be too intent on attitudinizing to make the most of her part of irresistibly fascinating enslaver of the opposite sex. But that's Madame Nazimova and perhaps her last appearance in Knoxville. I'm not sure about that, but anyway, this very same night, the reason I wanted to talk about Madame Nazimova being at Staub's Opera House, the same night over at the Bijou Theater, there was a performance by a woman from Ukraine named Sophie Tucker. And Paul, we have a image of her, don't we? This is Sophie Tucker, who a lot of you may remember her on TV in the 50s and 60s, but she was in the very early part of the 20th century, 1914. She was called the Mary Garden of Ragtime. Mary Garden was a Scottish opera singer who was sometimes called the Sarah Bernhardt of opera, in fact. But Sophie Tucker was the Mary Garden of Ragtime. And also known on the street as the last of the Red Hot Mamas, which she really enjoyed that title. She was notable for her kind of bawdy songs and humor. One of her famous songs from this era was "Nobody Loves a Fat Girl, but Oh How a Fat Girl Can Love." But she also recorded Some of These Days, which you might have heard. I think Leon Redbone recorded that song later on, and other people. But it was, but they described her. Miss Tucker talks through her rags in a very effective manner, and is as cordially liked as a performer of that type ever gets to be in Knoxville, and that's saying a good deal. She was did a lot of her stuff in Yiddish. She was had from a Jewish background from Ukraine, and often sang songs in Yiddish. But it was but she sang on the Bijou stage with an accompanist, a pianist whose name was Frank Westphal. And one of the papers remarked about how perfectly they worked together. That every time Sophie Tucker seemed to have a pause and needed some piano accompaniment, Frank Westphal would seem to come right in and play that piece. Frank Westphal became her husband about 2 years after her Bijou performance, even though they didn't stay married very long. And she would later say that she never could keep a husband for long because she was too used to doing things by herself. She earned her own money, she made her own decisions, she carried her own bags. That she was not someone who ever depended on a man, so she didn't need marriage, and that's why she never stayed married for very long. But anyways, a remarkable woman. She's known for her quotes, a lot of funny things she said over the years. But she remained a figure in show business through the middle of the 20th century. And it's interesting to think of her. When I think of Sophie Tucker, I think of her as a big, brassy, middle-aged or older woman. She was only, I think, 28 years old when she performed at the Bijou Theater. So this was very early in her career. She had just begun her career really just 3 or 4 years earlier. So this is a notable moment, I think, too, that Sophie Tucker was at the Bijou, even and across the street from Alla Nazimova. Um, but on the another theater, we had another theater called the Gem Theater in Knoxville, and that was the theater primarily for Black audiences down on Vine Street at the corner of Central. I'm sorry, I'll go to with Anna Pavlova first. She was the Russian ballerina who was at Staub's Opera House in April of 1915, and later was at the Bijou at least twice in 1960 and 1924. But she was one of the most famous dancers who's ever been performed in Knoxville. And she was at the Bijou in 1916 doing the Dumb Girl to Portici, which was a play that was the inspiration for a movie, or at least the same year. And at the Bijou in 1924, she was with the Ballet Russe, and thanks to Malcolm Miller of the Philharmonic Society, who later he was kind of the Ashley Capps of the early 20th century. He knew everybody and brought everybody here that he could. But an English born fellow who was a lumber executive, but became a writer about music, kind of an impresario, kind of an organizer, and sometimes was manager of theaters like the Tennessee Theater for a while. But when she came here in 1924, it's interesting that Pavlova emerged on stage as a glowworm, a squirming worm that kind of was emerging as a butterfly. Yeah, here's the Gem Theater, and the Gem Theater was a pretty big theater. By some accounts, it was almost as big as the Tennessee, but was the original version of it, at least. It burned during World War II and was rebuilt. But it was this is the original one, but a big theater that was mainly for Black people, but for some shows they would have special shows for white people, and they would have often the shows for white people would be earlier in the evening than the ones for Black people. But one of the most famous people who ever performed at the Gem Theater was in 1921, April 1921, a woman named Mamie Smith, who had just the year before recorded what's remembered as the very first blues vocal recordings. She was 29 years old when she performed here. She's famous for Crazy Blues, which is another song that Leon Redbone covered. But she had songs like "You Can't Keep a Good Man Down." Some of them had kind of double meanings. But her group was called Mamie Smith and her Jazz Hounds, and her records were being sold half a block away from here, at a furniture store. And that's the furniture stores are the places that sold records because they were accessories for phonographs, which were considered furniture. They were popular furniture. And to enjoy phonographs, you needed records. So furniture stores would sell records as well. But this was her height. This is the peak of her fame. One of the very first blues recording artists, one of the very first blues stars, before long before a lot of the others. But she also has a kind of a sad rest of her life. She died at age 55 in poverty and has only been kind of rediscovered in more recent decades. Okay, this one is pretty surprising. When I ran across this maybe 5 years ago, that Marian Anderson, and I grew up hearing the story of Marian Anderson and Eleanor Roosevelt intervening to let her perform when Marian Anderson was denied permission to sing at Constitution Hall in Washington D.C. in 1939. Eleanor Roosevelt said, "How dare you? You should sing. Maybe you should sing outside to a big crowd." And she put her on in front of the Lincoln Memorial, and drew a great big crowd. It became a very one of the most famous concerts in history. She was a soprano singer, mainly sang arias. She could have been an opera singer, but they couldn't figure out how to mix black and white in opera in those days. But she mainly sang arias from operas, but people just thought she had the greatest voice that ever was heard in America. She had already performed here at least twice, and when she came here again in 1927, she performed at the Logan Temple, where Marble Alley is now downtown off State Street. But in 1927, a women's group, a black women's group called the Altruistic Club, sponsored her performance at Staub's Opera House, which was mainly a white auditorium, but she sang for a biracial but segregated audience in Staub's Opera House in 1927. This is 12 years before she was denied the opportunity to sing at Constitution Hall because she was black. But this was not that big a deal. I mean, it was a big deal for the people who loved great music, and people were excited about the fact that she was coming here. But this is, as you can see, it earned a notice in the News Sentinel in 1925. The Logan Temple, and that's a picture of Logan Temple. But she came back 2 years later and sang at Staub's Opera House. So this is really something that Marian Anderson, and I hope people at the Rossini Festival on Saturday, as they walk down Gay Street, they realize that Marian Anderson sang on Gay Street in 1927. So we have a genuine operatic heritage here in Knoxville. All right, here's the Tennessee Theater, and some of you may know I wrote a book about the Tennessee Theater a few years ago, and it's still available, I think. But it's spent a lot of time, and this is before we had digital search options, trying to look up all these legends of performers, especially a few female performers like Fanny Brice, who was said to have performed there, and I couldn't tell under what circumstances or what, but Fanny Brice, I did not know until I researched it and found the original articles. Fanny Brice was here with the Ziegfeld Follies, the Ziegfeld Follies, on their only known tour of the South in 1935. Fanny Brice was a very famous comedian and singer. The 1930s, you probably know her through Barbra Streisand's portrayal of her in Funny Girl. But that was basically a true story of a talented young woman who kind of climbed her way to the top of show business. But when she performed in Knoxville, it was for variety. The Ziegfeld Follies, you probably know, was a variety show, and they had lots and lots of singers and skits and so forth. But when Fanny Brice was coming with the Ziegfeld Follies, it was the Tennessee Theater's biggest ever audience in history to this day, because they were selling standing tickets. People were standing in the back to get to see Fanny Brice and the Follies. They say it was there've been estimates that were it may as 2,500 people in the Tennessee Theater, which was built at that time to hold a little bit less than 2,000. But they claimed it was the biggest attraction ever beheld in Knoxville, and I don't question that. Well, it was the biggest attraction ever beheld in Tennessee, the Tennessee Theater, based on ticket sales for one performance anyway. But there were 100 performers. Anybody that remembers what the Tennessee Theater was like in those days, with the tiny little dressing rooms in the back, it's hard to picture 100 people back there. But several of them had later Hollywood careers, including the one notable diva, Eve Arden, who was, of course, later a very comic player on movies and TV. But she was just one of the chorus in the Ziegfeld Follies that night. Brice did 7 skits that night, 7 costume changes, mostly parodies, and one of them was a parody of Sally Rand, and I want to talk about her in a little bit. This was a big year for the Tennessee Theater. The fact that 1935 was the same year that I think the first Broadway show was ever shown at the ever performed at the Tennessee Theater. Mary of Scotland, and this was is forgotten now, but it was a big Broadway hit in early 1930s. And Helen Hayes, who acted the main role in Broadway, came down with the show to Knoxville in 1935 and was here with a couple of well-known performers. Philip Merivale and Pauline Frederick were both well-known actors on Broadway in those days. It was a story of Mary Queen of Scots. But it was a very big deal. She was 34 years old, fairly early in her career, but she came to Knoxville and actually was here for a while and had a look around town, walked around, was interested in some old buildings. But she did complain about something about the Tennessee Theater. She said it was too big, and of course the Tennessee Theater is much bigger than most Broadway shows. But she said she never had been on such a big, wide stage and found it very difficult to deal with for this play that had some intimate scenes. But anyway, that's worth remembering. She's one of the most famous actresses who's ever performed live in Knoxville. But the same year, someone on the opposite end of the spectrum in some ways, Fifi D'Orsay, who was famous for her very suggestive dances, and she was kind of a sex symbol in the 1920s and early 30s. And if you can see some of her dances on YouTube if you look them up. But she was here with the Earl Carroll Vanities, which had a reputation, which is kind of surprising for the Tennessee Theater, which we think of as kind of a staid old place. But it was the next best thing to a striptease show, more or less. But she was the star. She was the #1 billed star. She was dealing with some problems though when she got here. She had been accused by her troupe in the train on the way to Knoxville of being a communist, and they were all turning against her, and she still had to perform with these people who had been saying these ugly things about her on the train. And the newspaper described her, Knoxville paper described her as having labored courageously with an impossible and thankless part. She was 32 years old, and this is practically the end of her career as a sex symbol, at least. But she actually pops up several times in movies and TV and character parts. After that, I've seen her on Perry Mason in the late 50s, I think. But a beautiful woman who had kind of had a moment in the sun. They called her the French bombshell from Gay Paris, but in fact she never saw Paris in her life. She was from Canada, but she did speak French, so that was her excuse. But I mentioned earlier that Fanny Brice did parodies of Sally Rand, the famous striptease artist who was a fan dancer, I should call her, who played with giant feathers and fans and big rubber balls, and would dance with these, apparently naked behind them, and people never knew whether she actually was naked or not, but she would appear to be on stage. Yeah, Sally Rand came here just about 3 months after uh, 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 Fanny Brice made fun of her in Knoxville. I don't know if she was just trying to show Knoxville what she was really like or what. But she had been a major star of the Chicago World's Fair, one of the big draws to that World's Fair. But was at Staub's in January 1936 when she was 31 years old and still kind of at the height of her career. She not only performed here, a lot of people perform and go away and that's all they do. But she was here for a while here in Knoxville, and she spoke at the YWCA, the same YWCA that's still down in downtown Knoxville. They used to host lectures now and then. But she spoke and defended her profession as an artist, fan dancer. While she was here, she was interviewed for national radio by chance, an interesting coincidence. One of the most famous newspaper men in America, Haywood Broun, the Scripps Howard columnist and one of the most famous and controversial journalists in America at the time, was here to see Norris Dam, which was brand new in 1936 and kind of famous because it was the first big project of TVA, and people were uh, astonished at how beautiful Norris Dam was, and everybody wanted to see it. So many famous people came, even Jean-Paul Sartre came here to see Norris Dam, and Corbusier, and lots of people came here. But Haywood Broun came here to describe it. And while he was here, he got a note from his editor, said, "Please report to the station at 6:30 to interview Miss Sally Rand." So Haywood Broun interviewed Sally Rand for a national audience in Knoxville. But he talked about having to switch from being a rewrite man on his own pieces to live radio and then back again. But later on, about 2 years later, she was famous for Sally Rand's nude ranch at the San Francisco World's Fair. So an interesting moment in Knoxville history and in the history of Staub's old opera house, which was called the Lyric Theater by this time. Okay, Grace Moore is one of the local people. She was born in Cocke County, grew up mostly in Jellicoe, lived in Knoxville as a young girl for 3 or 4 or 5 years. The census of 1900 shows her living here. But she performed here a few times in the 20s and 30s. But she was an opera star in the 1920s and was one of the few opera stars who were able to cross over and have a career in Hollywood. In fact, she was the first actress ever to be nominated for an Oscar in a musical role for her movie One Night of Love. One Night of Love, it was called. And but anyway, she had a kind of a very glamorous career that lasted in the 1940s. She was actually traveling with I think the Prince of Sweden in 1947 when his plane went down in Europe and they were both killed. And she became the object of much veneration here in Knoxville. We named our first cloverleaf, interstate cloverleaf, the Grace Moore cloverleaf. And at the same time, we hosted the debut of the biopic about her with Kathryn Grayson, famous musical actress at the time, and her opposite Merv Griffin, who was a young, handsome young singer, in a biopic called "So This Is Love" in 1953, which had its debut at the Tennessee Theater. And Kathryn Grayson and Merv Griffin were both there in person at the Tennessee. The whole story of that is in the Tennessee Theater book. But thought we should throw her in because she was also later an inspiration for Mary Costa, who saw her as a little girl when Grace Moore performed at UT's Alumni Auditorium. And you said Grace Moore couldn't milk a cow, but a little bit of trivia about that when about her, the height of her fame in Knoxville when people were expressing a lot of interest in her career, her unusual career, which is both in opera in New York and in Hollywood. All right, Tallulah Bankhead was a pretty fascinating figure in history. There's some suggestion that she was here several times over the years, but she was from Alabama, had a lot of her career in New York. She was really more of a Broadway actress than a Hollywood actress, although she was in at least half a dozen Hollywood movies and later some TV shows. But she was booked here to play in 37, but was canceled for a flood. But most Tallulah Bankhead stories come from November of 1938, though. And this is a lot was there. She was here for several days. She arrived here in a Pullman car, a fancy Pullman car, and parked it over near the Southern Station and kind of held court there. People would come and interview her and describe how her fingernails and her kimono were the same shade of chartreuse, I think it was. But she did a play here called "I Am Different" at the Bijou, and it was a new play. She was trying it out, hoping it would make it to Broadway. A play about marital jealousy, which was an interesting subject for her because she had just gotten married herself. The only time in her life that she got married was to a young actor younger than she, named John Emery. It didn't last very long, but she was seen with him a few times in Knoxville, and was in fact they showed it as Paul and I discovered when we did the historic Bearden book. She showed up at the Highlands Grill with John Emery, and she was recognized, and they a lot of drunk guys at the Highland Grill started chanting about Alabama's football team, and she stood up and said, I'm from Alabama. I'm very proud of the Crimson Tide, and I would appreciate it if you just be polite tonight," and kind of shut them up. But anyway, she performed in this play that she liked, but Malcolm Miller, who the English-born kind of promoter of the arts here, didn't like it much. He said it's a superb cast in a rather awful opus. It talked about her Orson Wellesian shadow laugh that was a bit too much. It said Knoxville is he admitted that Knoxville has rarely seen a better cast or better acting. But another one of the actresses in that play was a woman named Fritzi Sheff, who was to some people was as famous as Tallulah Bankhead, and some people drove from Virginia just to see Fritzi Sheff because she had married a famous Virginian, and even though they're divorced now, she had married John Fox, the guy that wrote Trail of the Lonesome Pine. That was his former wife, and a lot of people had known her when she lived in Virginia. But anyway, the play apparently died before it got to Broadway, but we had some stories about Tallulah Bankhead instead. But very interesting lady, complex lady who lived kind of a wild life, not unlike that of Alla Nazimova. All right, this is Chilhowie Park, and I want to show this picture of the old exposition building that was built there in 1910. I think it achieved its full-fledged in 1913 for the National Conservation Exposition. It was a gorgeous big building. Unfortunately, it was made mostly of wood, and it burned up in a spectacular fire in the late 1930s. But wanted to show you that because that's the site of one of our next divas, and this is Ella Fitzgerald, when she was only about 20 years old, was here with the Chick Webb Orchestra. Now, this has some remarkable things about it. Chick Webb was a disabled Harlem band leader. He didn't like to travel anyway because he had a bad back, and he was not didn't tour much at all, and hardly ever came to the South because he hated segregation. But he came to Knoxville at least 3 times, and this is pretty interesting. And at least 2 of those times, he came with his newest singer, Ella Fitzgerald, and it's he came with her one time for a big dance at UT's Alumni Hall, but was twice at Chilhowie Park, including New Year's Eve, 1937-38, when he performed in that big, amazing building about a year or 2 before it burned down, with Ella Fitzgerald, who was just then becoming famous. And it's interesting. This is a local paper that Ella Fitzgerald to be featured by Webb's band. This is even before Tisket a Tasket and the things that were famous in the 40s. This is when she was just getting started, and people were just to remark about what a great voice she had. but she was there at Jailhouse Park at the big auditorium. And here's a woman who had some local connections, but not during the most of her career. She was from Georgia, had most of her career in New York. She had been famous since the 20s. She actually wrote songs. The song she sang, one of the most famous of her songs was "Wild Women Don't Have the Blues" in the 1920s. But they called her the uncrowned queen of the blues in the 20s. One of the early, not too long after Mamie Smith, one of the first black women to record blues discs with any success. But by some accounts, she was at the Gem as early as 1930, but was definitely there in 1938. And they say an all-colored show there, but all seats 40 cents. They had a big stage show for white only. There was a later show for black people, I think. That was usually the pattern. But she was here for that. This was right before her famous performance at Carnegie Hall, which was part of the From Spirituals to Swing series. That was kind of the height of her career, 1938, 39. But her name resonates with us because she had a stroke in 1945 and moved to Knoxville because her daughter lived here. Her daughter had been to Knoxville College and was a teacher here. And Ida Cox spent the last 20 years of her life here in Knoxville, singing only in the Patton Street Church of God, which was on Patton Street and in the Old Bottom area. But Ida Cox, because she lived here at the time she died, she is buried at New Gray Cemetery on Western Avenue. One of the very few really famous people who's buried in Knoxville. But that's Ida Cox. Ida Cox there. She made her last recording, by the way, in the early '60s in New York when she was living in Knoxville. Her only album, full-length album, the Blues for Basin Street is called, with the Coleman Hawken Quintet she played with, and it's really a great album. Now another performer, African American performer, was Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who's another one that a lot of people have never heard her name, but if you're in rock and roll, and especially if you were in rock and roll when rock and roll was starting, you knew about Sister Rosetta Tharpe because she introduced the electric guitar as a lead instrument. This was a brand in the 1940s. Electric guitar was a brand new thing. She loved the electric guitar and loved making it a solo upfront instrument. This is a remarkable thing that she did. But she traveled mainly with a gospel group, and she played electric guitar so well that she inspired a lot of other people who were not in gospel and who were on R&B and rock and roll. They call her she was the godmother of rock and roll. She pioneered electric guitar and electric blues. Keith Richards and people like this say that she started it all. Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. Other people, Eric Clapton was much inspired by her. Little Richard was inspired by her. Elvis was inspired by her, and they all acknowledged that at the time. But she was just really very good at what she did, but was for some reason completely forgotten. We don't think of women even today as lead electric guitarists. There are not, there are a few, but not many. But she was really the first. There was a documentary about her several years ago that was eye-opening to me. And naturally, I wanted to find out if she ever performed here. And yes, she did perform here when she was about 36 years old with a gospel group at Castle Park in 1951, July of '51, an outdoor concert to thousands of people. And who knows who she influenced at that show. But Wings Over Jordan. Smithson Stadium was was there before Bill Meyer Stadium was there. But same spot exactly. And here's the Jacob Building, which replaced the building we just saw a picture of at Chilhowie Park. It's a plainer building. This is the building that built after that one burned. The Jacob Building was built in the early 1940s. But the Jacob Building we think of as for kind of mundane things, for jelly contests and things like that during the Tennessee Valley Fair and gun shows and things like that. That's mostly what you see there today. But for many years, it had a lot of great shows, a lot of the great jazz and R&B performances, and the early rock and roll performers were there. But here's Sarah Vaughan at the Chilhowee Park Auditorium. That's what they called it, with Duke Ellington, Nat King Cole, made a major show in '51, the same year that Sister Rosetta Tharpe was here. But there were so many, mostly male, but so many performers from Little Richard to Fast Domino to Bo Diddley who performed in that same big room, and also of course Louis Armstrong and other people. But it's got a lot of heritage just in music, that one kind of plain looking building. But here's the Civic Auditorium, which kind of replaced it in some ways, and especially in terms of drawing African American performers. But a lot of performers like James Brown, who had first played at Chilhowee Park's Auditorium, later played bigger shows at the Coliseum, and that was true for Mahalia Jackson. She was of course a gospel singer, and very influential gospel singer. And she was, of course, the one a couple of years after this who was with Martin Luther King when he and she suggested that he talk about the dream, the "I Have a Dream" speech. She was the one that prompted that part of his talk that became so famous a couple of years later. But this was in 1961. The Civic Coliseum is a remarkable building because it was the first auditorium that was opened unsegregated. It was never desegregated because it was never segregated. It was open unsegregated. And she was one of the very first Black performers who played there. And she got some attention, unwelcome attention from racists when she was here. When she stayed at the Holiday Inn, which was, a lot of people weren't used to the idea of Black people staying at the white Holiday Inn. But that was another kind of landmark, playing at the Civic Coliseum and staying at the Holiday Inn when she did so. But she was another one of the divas, and so many different points we're covering with this talk. But it's that she was an important figure. By the way, Malcolm Miller, who had seen Tallulah, said last night, disclosed a powerful voice of unusual timbre, a vibrant, infectious personality, and a rhythmic method of vocalization that set the near capacity audience to feet tapping, hand clapping, and beatific exclamations. I'm hoping to hear that description of one of my talks one of these days. But this is anyway. This was a memorable show that I wish I remember myself. Maybe some of you do. All right, back to Chilhowee Park. This was Ike and Tina Turner. And Tina Turner had some local connections before she performed at Chilhowee Park in 1961 and 62 with her then husband, Ike. Of course, she became a major figure in pop music, but was already heading that way in 61. But she had lived here. She's famously from Nutbush in West Tennessee, a very small town in the country. But her father came to the Knoxville area to work for Oak Ridge during World War II, during the Manhattan Project era. And there are stories that Tina Turner, as a little, 4-year-old girl, was singing and dancing on the sidewalk for nickels in Knoxville now and then. But I'd love to find any documentation of that. But anyway, she certainly was popular here. She came back several times and was an important figure between R&B and rock and roll in those days. All right, and another major figure is one that we know well. Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton was opposite of some of these. Remember Lillie Langtry? Lillie Langtry probably had 100 articles about her before she ever performed in Knoxville. But Dolly performed here hundreds of times on the radio and in the streets. And we found only one article about her before she achieved stardom in Nashville in 1966. This article on the left, unsigned, 3 paragraphs about Dolly Parton, Sevier County high school student who has a 5-year contract with a recording firm, has a new record out, reportedly is selling well. We didn't really cover much country music in those days. That people didn't know that much about it, but she She was popular here. At least with the small radio audiences who came to see her at WIVK and sometimes on television. But she said that when she first began performing in Knoxville in 1958, roughly, I think she said she fell in love with her audience, and her audience was probably 60 people in a radio studio. But that was the beginning of her career. And it's interesting that we didn't. She never got attention for a show until she came here with one of these big Johnny Cash jamborees. Is what the way down on the list at the Civic Coliseum. She was people knew who she was by then, but she really had may not have recognized her as the little girl who was playing guitar on the street now and then and was playing on the radio in her early really literally childhood days. But she's become she is the world's diva now, and is someone that we should be proud that we launched, even though we didn't pay that much attention to her in her formative years. All right, this is one that we didn't talk about last month. Nina Simone was here in 1964. She's from you'd think she would have been here before, and maybe she was, but the earliest I found here was when she performed here in '64, because she was from not far from here. She was from Tryon, North Carolina originally. A lot of people think she was more from some exotic place because she had such an unusual name and such an unusual approach to music, very exotic sounds in her music, combining classical and blues and jazz and things in the style and piano and voice. She would do unpredictable things on stage, idiosyncratic style. But Nikki Giovanni knew her by records when she went to the Carter Roberts drugstore on Vine Street in the 1950s and fell in love with her voice, singing Porgy. But she did definitely perform here under very surprising circumstances at the University of Tennessee for homecoming weekend in November 1964. This is a kind of a funny article, High Hill. This is an article not about music, but about sorority and fraternity activities. This was a society page thing, and they were talking, but this has the most complete description of Nina Simone that you see in Knoxville papers in the early '60s. But was one of the few pieces that her name doesn't appear in a headline at all anywhere. But this was part of the Nahiyeli series, which was a series of dances at UT. They were organized by the Greek societies, the fraternities and sororities. And this is one of the first ones that I know of that was not actually a dance, that people didn't, probably didn't dance in a big room, and that was the main thing. This is like a few weeks after she performed Mississippi Goddamn on the Steve Allen show and shocked a lot of the nation. And people were breaking her records. They were angry about this, but she was angry about the murder of Medgar Evers in Mississippi a few months before that. And so she did kind of broke her form, which had been very bluesy and often very touching before that. This is an angry song, Mississippi Goddamn, which became very controversial. I don't know whether she performed that in Knoxville, and they say that she didn't seem to be in a very good mood, and actually played a shorter set than people expected. But these to get here and play in a basketball auditorium for a fraternity and sorority organization on homecoming after the Ole Miss game. They had the show after the Ole Miss football game, and her she was lined up with some unlikely people, including a woman named she was a white woman who was a comedian mainly, was performing along, probably opening for Nina Simone. But anyway, an unusual thing. I would like to have seen a review of it or something. But they thought it was important enough that the 1965 volunteer, the end of the school year that she played at the beginning of, they showed it had a picture of her in the UT yearbook, and they considered that important to feature her that way. But she was at the time she appeared in the yearbook, she was one of the most controversial singers in America, certainly. And that may have been it may have been a statement in that, may have not. I'm not sure, but that was an unusual event for especially the Nahieli series. Like I say, before that, it had been mainly orchestras playing for dances. Sometimes famous orchestras like Tommy Dorsey, but mainly like that. But all right, and in the same venue, a couple of years later were the Diana Ross and the Supremes. And this was a critical month, April of 1967, in the history of the Supremes. They had started out as the Supremes and were becoming known as Diana Ross and the Supremes. But it was this month that one of the members, and those names are correct, but they're in the wrong order in the caption. Diana Ross is on the right, Mary Wilson is in the middle, and on the left is Florence Ballard. Florence Ballard was parting to the trio at the time and was being replaced. Some people, including Marvin Gaye, thought she was the best singer of the three. But she had some personal problems. She had personal problems with Diana Ross becoming the kind of the lead member, and she was no longer in the group by the time the summer came around. So if she was there, even there at that night, they announced that she was. This was one of the last times that Florence Ballard performed with the Supremes. But it's anyway, it was an interesting moment at the old field house, aka the Stokely Athletic Center. And in the same place, Stokely Athletic Center, was Janis Joplin, and this was a surprise to me that she appeared in Knoxville at all. I never heard that, but I've since heard from several people who saw that show, including my friend Jenna Mashburn, who had known Janis Joplin back in Austin, Texas, and was really worried about hearing her singing in 1969, worried that she was ruining her voice, that her blues style, kind of screaming style, that this was not a way to make a long career as a singer. But of course, the following year she had died of a drug overdose. So this was a performance not to be missed. Again, I think it was right after a homecoming. Isn't it funny that Nina Simone and Janis Joplin were here for football homecoming weeks at UT? But that was these were shows I would love to have seen and be able to talk about from. But I want to talk about this is an ongoing thing, that there have been a lot of famous people and a lot of these influences have taken effect. Like people like Mary Costa, remembering Grace Moore performing, but so many other people, Cheryl Studer from Knoxville, but all these other female performers have been here, but you never know what you're missing. This is Taylor Swift. When Wayne Bledsoe, the News Sentinel, interviewed her in 2006 when she was a high school kid, and she was performing for something called Aquapalooza, which was it was a boat show in Lenore City. But this is something in what 18 years ago that we would all be bragging about if we'd been there. Haven't found anyone who remembers seeing Taylor Swift there, but Wayne Bledsoe was saying that everyone should pay attention to this young woman. But so it's going on. There are of course hundreds of others we could talk about, but I thought I did a few high points just because these are kind of surprising dots to connect and interesting influences, and they show how performers kind of become for a short or a long time part of the culture of a city and have influences on other people there. And of course, Dolly Parton had her own influences that people she idolized and people who idolize her today. But this unfolds, but I think it's worth remembering the whole story as we talk about the history of performances in Knoxville. Would love to take any questions or have any comments. That when we gave this talk last month, I was interested that a couple of people remembered the Supreme show and the Janis Joplin show. If y'all have any memories of these, would love to hear them. But if you have any questions too, I'd be happy to talk about those. Well, appreciate your coming out very much, and I like the fact that we've got this on recorded and online, because I think it's important for people to remember that Knoxville. It's also evidence that Knoxville was connected to the world in many ways. I think people often forget that when they make assumptions about the city.